Chapter 8 In Flight, in which we ponder the eternal question, how good were the good old days? The morning after his interview with the sheriff and the witch, Peter boarded an international Lufthansa flight from New York's LaGuardia Airport, bound for Frankfurt, Germany. The last time he'd flown on a plane, it was powered by propeller engines, seats were roomy, full meals were served in flight by polite and pretty hostesses who seemed genuinely glad to serve you. The napkins were cloth, the dinnerware was made of real glass and china, utensils weren't made of flimsy anti-terrorist plastic, and all of the passengers applauded after every successful takeoff and landing. Things had changed since. Now the airport was an oppressive mess. The flight crew seemed annoyed at the passengers just by virtue of their existence. The seats were cramped, and the meal, designated a snack actually, and $6 extra for those in coach, was a pre-packaged mystery in aluminium foil. Worst of all, no one besides Peter seemed at all impressed by the absolute miracle of the flight itself. Crossing an ocean in less than a day? Wondrous. Surrounded by grumps and the terminally jaded, he pulled out his book, a paperback detective story, and settled in for a long flight. Chapter 9 A Little Touch of Max in the Night, in which a terrible transformation is completed and Max passes up a good meal. After everyone else had scattered into the darkness, screaming and crying and moaning their fears, Max stood alone for a moment in the small circle of soft, flickering light given off by the dying campfire. He felt the blood drying on his face and the alarming thrill of what he'd done. He trembled with the enormity of it. There would be no going back now. Max Piper was no more. The flute-playing son of a flute player had died forever, victim of the same heavy whetstone that had brutally transformed his father into raw memory and carcass. Max, the heroic swordsman, was also gone forever. Some part of his mind recognized that version of himself as nothing more than the temporary conjuration of a boy wishing to become a man. Only Max, the great and terrible beast of the Black Forest, remained, neither a child nor an adult, not even a man, but a completely new sort of thing, ageless and eternal, and totally lacking human compassion, or love, or, most important, guilt. Instead, the new Max possessed appetites, cunning and calculation, and that was enough. He considered the various packs left abandoned in the campsite, along with the food, the blankets, and most of the warm clothing. Each pack, of which there were 12 in total, contained a fat purse of gold marks, and all of it belonged to him now. But gathering his money would have to wait. There was a much more pressing treasure that needed collecting now, before it was lost forever. Frost was out there in the dark with Peter. That's what needed sorting out first and foremost. Frost's taker, still hanging heavy in one hand, was eager to be about its work and needed to drink deep of Thief Peter's innards. Only then the family treasure would be restored to its true owner. Only then would things be set right. That's what Max needed to do first, before Peter could get away. Mere gold could wait. Max stepped into the darkness, following in the direction he'd watched Peter go just 2 or 3 minutes earlier, dragging his sobbing little sweetheart behind him. Before long, Max was as lost and confused in the pitch black of the endless forest as everyone else must be. At first, he thought about finding his way back to the camp and making a torch from the fire, but he quickly discarded the idea, realizing that, although it would certainly provide him greater light to see by, it would also alert others to his coming. Even someone as stupid as filthy little Peter couldn't help but easily avoid someone carrying a lit torch in the night. No, Instead, Max would creep silently and carefully, pausing often to listen. That's how the other night prowlers hunted, and he was certainly one of them now. He did so, and in time his practice was rewarded. Pausing at the top of a slope, Max heard the quiet murmur of a stream far below, accompanied by distant voices. Listening intently, halting his own breathing to help unmask the nearly inaudible sounds, he eventually recognized Peter's voice, along with a bratty Peep girl. It was hard to be certain, but they seemed to be arguing about her shoes, or perhaps just one shoe, along with something he couldn't fully make out about a snail. Ever so slowly he began to creep down towards them, taking care not to slip and thereby betray his presence. By the time Max reached the stream at the bottom of the gully, he could hear Peter and Bo quite clearly now, on the water's far side, crawling up the opposite slope. Max let them get farther up the hill into the tree line before crossing the stream after them. Be patient, he had to remind himself, when his every desire was to throw caution to the wind and dash boldly up the hill. Stealth and guile is what will win this night's contest. Oddly, he began to suspect that he wasn't the only one in danger of surrendering to impetuosity. Was it only his imagination? Or could he now actually feel Froststaker's intense hunger for Peter's blood? It seemed to practically vibrate in its sheath, like a prize colt being restrained from its desire to run. After he judged that his prey was far enough up the hillside so that Max could not be easily overheard, he began to climb. It was beginning to get easier now to track them, and Max's confidence was growing to fit the new circumstances. Not only were his eyes adjusting to the darkness by now, it had been 30 minutes at least since he was exposed to the camp's firelight, but the children seemed intent on making his task easier by talking all the time. Max continued to climb, and then he stopped. No, he hadn't intended to stop, but he stopped all the same. He wasn't overly tired from the steep climb and felt nothing physically holding him. His desire to continue was undiminished, was growing, in fact. But even so, he remained still, as if rooted in place, halfway up the hillside. Then, softly at first, Max began to hear the music. It was Peter, somewhere up above him, and he was playing a tune on Frost. Was the child insane? Who stops to play a flute when he's on the run from any number of angry soldiers? Did he want to be caught? The music swelled in volume, and Max's understanding grew with it. He'd heard the same tales of the ancient flute's powers that Peter had, and realized that Peter was using Frost's magic to make danger pass him by. That's why Max was suddenly stuck in place. Amazing. But how could Peter have known how close Max was to overtaking them? I must have made some sound, he thought, giving myself away in some manner. The music continued, and as it did so, Max had an increasing desire to turn and retreat back down the slope and then splash his way back across the stream. But then, before he could act on the growing compulsion, he was frozen in place by a new sound. "What have you done to me, boy?" It was a terrifying voice that shook Max to his bones. This was neither Peter nor Bo. It was the voice of something huge and deadly, not in the normal way of fearsome, but entirely comprehensible dangers, but deadly in the way the old gods themselves must have used the word. The creature went on to say more, but Max didn't make it out, because just at that moment something came crashing down on him from above, striking him with such force that he was sent tumbling down the hillside, not stopping until he lay stunned, half in and half out of the chilling waters of the stream. Somewhere along the way he'd heard high screaming, which might have been his own, but he couldn't quite bring himself to believe it. A beast of the night didn't scream, at least not in such a high pitch. Gradually his senses began to return, and Max made out the dim figure of a little girl standing over him, holding a sword to his chest. It was Bo Peep, and the sword was his own Frost-Taker. That was impossible. Frost-Taker would never allow any hand but his to wield it, and yet here was this ridiculous little girl, crying and shaking all the while, but definitely holding the sword towards him. "Don't move, soldier," she sobbed, "or I'll run you through." "I'm no soldier," Max shouted in return. At the same time, he discovered that the spell holding him in place was gone now. Wait, that wasn't true. On further examination, it was still in place, because he realized he couldn't possibly make himself return up the hill to where Peter was still playing his haunting tune. But that same spell wasn't keeping him from all movement, and did nothing at all to protect Bo, down here with him in the gully. Max could tell that he was perfectly free to take his sword back and slaughter little Bo Peep with it. "Either my brother doesn't actually love you after all," Max said, "or the magic only works to protect him. Isn't that hilarious?" "Max?" Bo said, and there was fear and confusion in her voice. "Give me my sword back, girl, and I'll protect you, since Peter seems unable or unwilling to do it." Max reached out, but Bo took a step back. She still had a sword, and its point remained fixed somewhere between his chest and throat. "You look strange, Max," she said. "Sort of wild in the eye." "Give me my sword, you stupid little witch!" This time Max lunged at Bo, who screamed once and flailed wildly with the blade, catching Max on the base of the thumb. This time it was Max who screamed in pain and rage. That was too much for Bo. She dropped the sword and ran off once more into the night. Max's first instinct was to follow her and gut her from neck to belly for cutting him. But then he thought he'd better first find out how deep the cut was. He stood and tried as best as he could in the nearly non-existent light to examine his bleeding palm, and while he did this, the music of the flute continued above him, while the forest all around him reverberated with the howls of a great and savage monster. Gradually, over the span of an hour or more, the bestial howling faded into the distance. Max couldn't find Peter again after that night, nor was he able to find Bo or the camp where his gold waited for him to come back and retrieve it. And who knows, those 12 purses of good Hessian marks might still be there today, patiently waiting for someone to discover them. Like Peter, Max had also learned enough basic woodcraft from their mother to recognize many edible plants and mushrooms, and like Peter, that was how he survived those first long days and nights following the incident at the camp. During that time, unknown to either brother, their lives paralleled each other's. Both wandered without direction, living on scavenged plants and grubs. But unlike Peter, Max didn't remain alone in the woods for long. On his 4th, or possibly 5th day, Max stumbled into a small clearing where 2 of the Peep Girls were huddled, more dead than alive, under the half-hollow trunk of a giant fallen evergreen. "Look, Dorothy, look! Here's Max come out of the woods like an angel to save us." It was either Bridget or Alfred who was pointing at him, as if he were a handsome prince come to take her away on a white stallion. In all of their past visits, Max had never bothered to learn one Peep daughter from another very well, and now, in their dirty and disheveled state, it was even harder to tell them apart. Both girls crawled out from under the fallen tree and clutched at him, frantically, the way a mother claws at a lost child who is suddenly restored to her, not quite willing to trust such a happy miracle.
"We ran and ran,"
Dorothy said, tears streaming down her dirty face.
"Bridget and Alfred and I, but a creature got poor Alfred."
That cleared up the minor mystery of which daughters he'd found.
"There wasn't even any sound,"
she continued, hiccuping the story out in short fragments between sobs.
"I thought Alfred just tripped, but then she said, 'Something bit me,' just like that, real quiet, as if it wasn't anything important. But then something pulled her down into a deep hole. A fell beast's den,"
Bridget interjected.
"Oh, then there was such screaming,"
Dorothy said.
"and ripping and tearing sounds. Bones crunching,"
Bridget added.
"We heard every moment of it. And all the while Alfred kept calling out to us, 'Don't leave me,' she cried over and over again. But we did. We ran away."
And then both girls seemed to simultaneously run out of the power to continue their account. They looked up at him, whether for forgiveness or judgment, it was impossible to say. "Do you have any food?" was all Max said in reply.
"None at all,"
Bridget managed to whisper between great and gasping breaths, as if any additional wind for speaking had quite deserted her. "Then what business can we have with each other?" Max said. Slowly, he drew Frost-Taker out of its sheath. Days later, as he stumbled again through the forest, lost and directionless, Max considered that he might have made a serious mistake where the two Peep Girls were concerned. He'd taken their clothing, which he had every right to. He'd torn it into rags and stuffed them inside of his own clothes for additional padding against the night's chills, but he'd left their bodies untouched. It was a waste of meat on the bone, he thought. At the time he couldn't bring himself to consider such an unthinkable sin, the eating of one's own kind, but now he reminded himself that he was no longer of any kind save his own. He was a new creature of which there was only one in the whole wide world. He should have recalled that back when it could have helped him, back when he stood over their ridiculously available flesh. What a waste, he thought. I could have feasted, but instead I go hungry. That's what I get for clinging to compassion, which no longer has a proper place in my heart. He stumbled and wandered, living on roots and berries, but there was never enough. No matter how much he found, he was always hungry. Then, one day, long after he'd given up keeping count of the days, Max emerged from the wood onto a small dirt road, which cut its narrow and winding way through the forest like the passage of a serpent. This was no major road, down which more invading troops could march. This was little more than a walking path. Only the smallest of carts could navigate this track. "It doesn't matter," Max called aloud. "Any path, no matter how small, means I'm saved." This path would lead to places where people lived, or at least to a bigger road where there would certainly be towns and farmsteads somewhere down the line. Since he was thoroughly lost by this time and had no idea in which direction the path ran, Max chose a direction at random and set out following it. Night fell quickly while he walked down the lane, as it always did in the deep forest. But in little more than an hour, the path led to a small and tidy cottage tucked among the trees. There was a garden on one side of the cottage, and on the other side a small fenced-in yard containing a milk cow and 2 fat pigs. A low shed anchored the far side of the fenced yard. Many clucking chickens wandered here and there around the homestead. A trail of inviting smoke rose out of the cottage's chimney. Light flickered from the one window that he could see from the direction of his approach. Max could hardly believe his turn of good fortune. He stepped forward at a lively, almost jaunty pace, drawing his blade as he did so. The evidence of fire made him think of cooked meals and a hot bath. While he was still at least a dozen paces away from the front door, he'd already begun to think of this place as his new home, his very private new home.